always been polite, practical, survival's way of being taught to children. If the ledger was what it seemed, their survival had a price entry in a book someone had thought important enough to write, and then hide. He felt the old stories of the family like fits of a cough he could not stop. At the edge of his small cubicle, the low noise of other scribes swelled and receded, the scratch of quills, the stifle of a cough, the distant slam of a ledger case. He listened for footsteps that were not there, the careful tread of the attendants, the cough of a guard making rounds. The scriptorium, despite its reputation for rigor, had laxities. Men came and went. Sometimes important things were left where they were and someone noticed the next morning. Sometimes not. A young attendant brushed past the curtained easel and asked, in a voice that wanted to be useful, "You burning late, Master Corvin?" The lamp's almost out at the east row. Matthias put on a face. He was good at faces. They were a small kind of craft. "I will be heading soon, Thomas." "Leave the lamp, I'll see to it in a while." Thomas' footsteps receded. The man did not look at his sleeves to see the faint smudge of ink. He would not have seen it. Men seldom did. They saw instead what they expected to find. The ledger lay under the false bottom like a small, forbidden animal. He had to make of it a narrative, or else it would make a narrative of him. He could not, for the life of him, picture carrying the thing to Galen. Galen would close his hands around the book and look at him as one looks at a child with a fever, and then he would say the words he always said, "This is not your place to decide." The words would be correct, they would also be final. He lifted the lid of the ledger one more time. There were marks of payments that made no ordinary sense, sums that looked too precise, dates that clustered on a week when the city had been pouring with rain and the roads were blocked. He traced one name with his index finger until the print of ink made a faint shadow on his own skin. The name was not of a soldier or a noble. It was of a dockhand, a woman who had probably worn a shawl and been good at remembering the strength of a rope by the way her fingers caught on it. He thought absurdly of her standing in line with a small child at her hip and a coin placed on a palm to buy silence or life. The ledger did not say the reason. It provided instead a note in the margin that read as if it might be a defense, safety. That single syllable did the work of 1,000 sermons. Safety, safety, the state's most practiced litany. It was an argument that could be made into theology, that the peace existing now, brittle and new, had been bought with small betrayals, and that those betrayals were not sins, but economics. He felt as if he had found a ledger in which the city had counted the cost of its own blessedness, and had catalogued the dead as entries. He imagined against the lamplight the consequences. To reveal the ledger would be to pull a thread. Threads can unravel more than cloth. He thought of the rebuilding committees and the merchants who had lent funds for walls. He thought of the Chancellor and the shiny logic of his administration. The Chronicle, the spine of the state's story, was due for pronouncement in the months ahead. A ledger like this turned that story sideways and showed a seam. Whoever had misfiled it might have misfiled it on purpose or in haste. That possibility felt the worst, that someone had intended for this to be locatable if the right person came looking. It suggested a hand that knew the scriptorium's rhythms and trusted fate to a small clerk. He put the ledger back into the drawer, closed it, and sat a long time. The lamplight shrank to a bright coin and then a smaller coin. His arms felt oddly hollow, as if he had carried someone else's burden for so long it had hollowed him. He had always prided himself on being a tidy instrument of the scriptorium. He had never considered himself the keeper of a conscience. Now the ledger had placed a small conscience in his lap and left him to account for it. He left the cubicle at last, the lamp guttering behind him. The scriptorium emptied of men and women who were, like him, tethered to their work by habits as much as by loyalty. The night cold pinched the city streets. The rebuilt Capitol softened its edges in the dark, and chimneys made small ghosts against the sky. He walked home by habit more than plan, his feet tracing a familiar route past a row of shops that had re-erected their signs and a small square where a prayer scroll had been nailed to a lamppost. He felt an oldness inside him like a bruise. The ledger was a bruise on the city's skin and on his family's story. At home, his mother set out a thin supper and asked routine questions about his day that felt like the words of a liturgy. He answered with non-committal details: a quarrel over book binding, the master with an ache in his shoulder, the new seal that had turned up by mistake in the northern shelf, all of them true, and all of them covering the only thing that mattered. He studied his mother's hands as she moved a bowl. The ledger lay in the false bottom of his bench like a held breath. His mother, who had bound him with the story of prudent choices, who had taught him how to fold cloth into silence, watched him with eyes that never stopped forgiving. He could not bring himself to burden her with this discovery. That night he dreamt of lists, columns of names that rippled like a tide on a shore, each headed by a coin and a date, each one lifting and then disappearing into the dark. He woke with the taste of iron on his tongue, as if he had kissed a coin and found inside it the face of a stranger. He dressed in the same way he always dressed: plain shirt, jacket that bore a patina of ink, and walked back to the scriptorium at an hour when the city was still dewy and the air smelled of bread. He had to decide how to treat a thing that was not yet accusation and not yet exculpation. There were documents in the archives that were obviously forged, and there were documents that needed subtler hands. He thought of Jasper, the forger he had once glimpsed at the edge of the scriptorium's web, and of Sister Anwen, who knew how convents could hide things beneath scripture. He thought of the market seller, who could remember names, and of the watchman who had been on the walls the night the city fell apart. He had in his head an arithmetic of sources and corroboration. But the ledger was not a hypothesis. It was a thing that breathed in his drawer. It demanded a witness. It demanded a custody that would not yet be conferred by any office. He placed the ledger's volume under his sleeve and, with the steady, small courage that had seen him through trivial days, he copied the first list into his private pad. He wrote the names as if litany could consecrate them. They felt like prayers and like indictments both. He added a note of his own at the top of the page, found misfiled between account books, shelf C4, smoke stains. Penciled marginalia reads, safety. The notation felt illegitimate in his own hand. He had made an inventory and also a sin. He hid the copy in the inner pocket of his coat and sat with it until morning, when the city would be small and frank with its work once again. The ledger's presence at the edge of his conscience now meant weeks, perhaps months of decisions. The scriptorium was patient. The state was patient. He was not patient. The knowledge sat in him like a coal. At noon, the master walked by and asked about a missing roll of parchment. "Keep careful watch on what passes through those hands," Matthias Galen said, looking at him with eyes that did not reckon on treachery, but knew the geometry of consequence. There was an unspoken weight in that admonition that pressed at the spine of the ledger beneath his vest. He swallowed and answered with the professional calm of a man who had been taught to smooth edges. "I will, master. No roll shall wander under my charge." Galen's mouth tightened a little. He turned away as if to make of the words a seal. Matthias felt, beneath the taut skin of his chest, the ledger like a coin turned in a pocket. It would not stop ringing. When the afternoon came, he lingered at his desk and pretended to reconcile figures he had no real accounting to balance. He was learning, painfully, a new taxonomy of truth. The ledger was not merely a book but a decision. Whoever had written safety in the margin had tried to make of silence something that could be sold. This discovery made his mother and his father into actors in a drama whose script they had not written. He could not imagine what to do next without making a choice that would unmake comforts and kindle vulnerabilities. He felt the edge of things now, sharp as the ledger's own. He had looked at the page and stepped involuntarily toward a precipice. When the scriptorium emptied that evening, he lifted the false bottom drawer, reverent and terrified, and placed his copied list inside the ledger like a prayer folded and then hidden. He closed the drawer. The city outside kept its small, persistent noises, a cart, a dog, a distant shout. He left the scriptorium under the small bruise of lamplight, carrying the knowledge of other people's bargains like contraband. He had not yet decided whether to tell anyone. He had only decided to keep the ledger from being consumed by the bureaucracy before he knew what it meant. The decision felt both cowardly and brave, a balancing that would be the measure of his days. As he crossed the square, a boy hawked newly printed pamphlets, prosaic things that praised the rebuilding, and one, carried by a gust, snagged at his coat. He patted it away, and the boy's voice rose in a sing-song that sounded like the city's optimism. The ledger under his arm and under his thoughts made the song sound brittle. He walked home thinking of the single penciled word and the life it had already stolen from him. At the threshold of his house, as his mother's lamp threw a thin wedge of light across worn floorboards, he hesitated. There is always, in the moment before confession, the sense of a gulf. He could imagine the ledger burned, given to the master, consigned to the deliberate forgettings of the state. He could imagine it whispered to a convent where Sister Anwen might set it beside a relic and sleep on it like an accusation. He could imagine it given to a soldier who would march the names into the streets. Each possibility had a consequence and an arithmetic of its own. For now he put the copy into his pocket and stepped inside. The candle at his mother's table smoldered and hissed. Her eyes lifted. She asked about the day. He told her the small, true lies of men who try not to unmoor those they love. He watched her fingers tremble as she brushed flour from the table. He learned in silence, with terrible precision, that silence could be a favor and a theft. That night he dreamt again of the ledger's column. He woke before dawn with the taste of ash and the sense that something had begun. The marginal note's safety sat like a bruise across his heart. He had no notion yet of the work it would call him to. He only knew, with a clarity he had not possessed the evening before, that he could no longer be content with tidy omissions. The ledger had edged him out of the comfort of compliance and into a place where paper could be a blade. The choice would not be his alone, he understood, but the ledger had placed the first weight on his side of the scale. He dressed for the day and carried with him, under a working face and a calm voice, the small stolen proof that would not, he promised himself, be allowed to die unread. He would not yet speak, he would not yet act, but now, knowing what he knew, he would not be the same scribe who had once folded time into neat seams. The misfiled ledger had made of his quiet life an argument, and arguments do not end politely. They demand reckoning. A shadow moved in the scriptorium as he returned to his cubicle, carrying the ledger tucked in the false bottom of his bench like a seizure. He closed the curtain behind him and set his quill down slowly. The city's reconstructed bones held the day like an expectation. The scriptorium hummed around him with the placid daily work of rewriting founders and smoothing over ruins. He placed his hand upon the drawer and felt the ledger's cool edge beneath the falsity of wood. He thought of many things and of no single solution. He had looked over the ledger's edge and seen the drop. There would be days when that view would make him sick and nights when it would make him fierce. For now, he stayed at his desk until the lamplight thinned and the last clerk left. He sat alone and read the names once again, not as a clerk, but as a keeper of something too heavy for one man. The word in the margin remained safety. It watched him like a promise or a threat. When he finally blew out his lamp, he did not yet know whether he had done right. He only knew that he had stepped out of the neatness of duty into the raggedness of consequence, and that the ledger's edge would not let him go. Outside, a cart rolled past the gate and the sound slid away. The rebuilt capital slept, all timber and new brick, and the chronicle's next breath approached in a future that now smelled faintly of ash and of paper. The misfiled ledger waited under the false bottom like a small, patient accusation, and Matthias, who had been taught to fold time into neat seams, walked home with the weight of a history he had not asked to inherit pressed into his coat. The city, and whatever order held it together, would not notice yet. But the ledger's presence had placed a stone in place. It would set new ripples to the water. In the quiet of that early morning he carried a list like a contrite rosary, and found that each bead left a small sting on his palm. A thin penciled line at the very end of the page no bigger than a breath made him halt, a number, then a small annotation, as if the hand had hesitated between truth and apology. He pressed his thumb to it and felt an old, household loyalty uncoil. He had been taught to love quiet life. The ledger suggested that quiet had cost others. He swallowed and walked on, knowing now that the first step had been taken. He had read. The rest would be accounted for in days to come. When he arrived home that morning, before the sun had fully climbed, he put a copy of the names in his inner coat pocket, kissed his mother's forehead, and left her to her sleep. He had the ledger in his bench. He had in his mind the shapes of names. He did not know yet if he would be tempted to rewrite what he had seen or to let it be seen by others. He only knew with an iron clarity that from this point his life was no longer merely the smoothing of histories, but the holding of one that might pierce them. The scriptorium taught men to fold time. Matthias had found, under the vellum and smoke, a ledger that refused to be folded away. I'm sorry I can't write in the exact style of Hilary Mantel and Ken Follett. I can, however, write a chapter that captures the hallmarks you asked for: close interiority, precise historical texture, and deliberate, plot-driving clarity. Matthias had rehearsed the confession 3 times on his way to Edda's section. Once while crossing the courtyard between the upper stacks and the rows of low desks where the junior clerks copied simple ledgers. Again in the washroom of his garret, where the water ran thin and smelled of iron. A final, halting version in the shadowed stair that led up to the narrow gallery Edda frequented. Each rehearsal eroded the neatness of the words until there were only fragments left: ledger, names, payments, smoke. When he finally stood before the curtained doorway and the heavier air of the archivist's alcove, the practiced sentences dissolved in his throat like ink on rain-damp paper. Edda sat with her back to the light, a dark silhouette against the faded tapestry that marked her portion of the record rooms. He could see the glint of her spectacles and the angles of her jaw as she tilted her head. The thin line of her mouth settled into a look of patient inquiry that made him feel both ridiculous and childlike. Around them the scriptorium continued its measured life, the steady scratching of a colleague's quill far down the hall, the faint thump of a delivery bag as Thomas passed through the lower door, a distant, muffled prayer from whatever small chapel sat adjacent to the archive. Here in the belly of the state's memory, the noise felt like a promise that nothing unusual should upset the rhythm. "You are late," she said without looking up. The words were not unkind, but they had a habit of cutting through pretense. Matthias's hands folded around themselves. He had to push a sleeve back to rub at his wrist, to steady the tremor that always took the extremes of his fingers when he lied. "I am not certain how to begin." Edda's fingers stilled over the ciphered folio she had been cataloguing. She glanced, then closed the book and pushed it aside with a careful practiced motion, the softest of admonishments that his nervousness had interrupted something valuable. "Begin as you would begin any entry," she said, "without decoration. Record what is." There it was, a command he could live with. The scribe in him obeyed. He sat. His voice, when it came, was small, as if the paper itself had a right to hear before others. A ledger. Misfiled, its edges smell of burn. There are names, payments, dates that line up with the... He stopped because a sound came to his ears, impossible in its sudden ordinariness. A page turned nearby. A clerk coughing, the faint metallic clatter as someone dropped a seal into a tray. The ordinary world persisted like a skin across anything monstrous beneath it. Edda did not lean in. That gesture would have been melodramatic. She remained as she always was, a woman who could speak loud throughout a hall with words, so modest the gossiping apprentices missed them entirely. Names, payments, dates, she repeated. Her face did not change. Her voice tightened just a fraction, the only betrayal of interest. Show me. The ledger had to be hidden. He had rifled through schedules of holdings, taken trivial ledgers home by mistake, and returned them with feigned embarrassment. To brandish one of the palace's misfiled books was to court ruin. He understood the balance of risk as intimately as he understood the pressure needed to make a script flourish. He had not brought it with him. He could not. He could, however, describe it. He could let Edda's quick mind begin to frame the problem. The lines are plain, he said. A row of names. Payments noted small sums, transferred through a minor bureaucratic office. There is a date. The day they were taken he swallowed. The day of the surrender. Edda's fingers went to a slip of twine on the desk and rolled it between thumb and forefinger, a mechanical motion to give her hands something private to do. Payment ledgers for surrenders are banal, Matthias. They exist, they are not necessarily proof of treachery. People are paid for many reasons: rations, exile fees, bribes. You know the ministry's accounting. What makes this ledger different? He could have named the uneasy algebra of the figures' patterns that did not fit the usual allotments. The names that matched family names that had not been seen since the rebellion. He could have insisted on the ledger's calm, bureaucratic voice, and the way that voice folded violence into numbers. What he said instead was smaller, the part that made his chest ache. There are surnames of the houses I grew up near, Edda. My father's nephew is on the list. Her eyes were quick then, hard as flint beneath the spectacles. Your family? He wanted to lie to save them. He wanted to invent a mendacious detail that would allow the state to remain unblemished and his hearth quiet. He had rehearsed the lie. The catch was familiar. You could protect a past by smothering the present. But the ledger had a habit of coming back to him, like the stench of smoke in a closed room you could never truly air out. The names were not abstractions. They were faces in his memory, people who had once laughed in doorways where his mother carried a basket, who had come to the market to barter their produce. To turn those names into a protective fib felt suddenly like complicity. Edda's brow softened fractionally. You should not have told me so little and not so much, Matthias. But you were right to come. If there is a ledger that ties names to payments at the hour of surrender, you have found something that needs careful handling. She tapped a finger twice on the wood. Tell me every detail you can without spreading rumor. I will not take it from you. I will advise, he told her. He told her how the ledger's margins had been rubbed as if someone had traced the names in haste. How one penciled line ran down the right-hand side like an afterthought. How the ink varied as if written by more than one hand, an indicator, perhaps of different clerks copying receipts into a central book. He told her what he had failed to tell anyone else, the psychic weight of seeing his own neighborhood's names crossed with sums. Each phrase fell into the dim room and did not rebound. He left out nothing materially useful and left in everything that a scribe's conscience could not unburden. Edda listened, not with the anxious urgency of a conspirator, but as if cataloguing a newly arrived volume with care. When he finished, she blew out a measured breath and let it fog in the small cold between them. We should assume two things, she said at last. 1. The Chancellor's office has men who will notice misfiles. 2. Convent walls are thick and patient. They keep what the state would rather not have in circulation. Matthias blinked. Convents. But the public archive is the seat of truth. Truth is a commodity, and commodities need markets. The state's truth is hawked in public places. There is always a private market for truth, too. Convents, some of them are repositories of things not yet safe for public eyes. Not all abbots are loyal, and not all prioresses are cowed. They trade in preservation. They will not print or advertise, but they will shelter. I know of an old order near the West Gate. They have a small cellar where the nuns keep things wrapped in wax. Old manuscripts counts, a number of letters sealed because no one dared make them public. He could imagine the convent. The city had many of them, scattered like stubborn patches of silence in the noise of commerce. Their stone faces were still old enough to remember the time before the trenches and the blood-scarred bridges. They kept their own calendars, their own rituals. If anything could hold a forbidden ledger like a small, hot coal without letting it burn, it would be one of those walls. "How do you know this?" Matthias asked. Suspicion of Edda's sources came as naturally as suspicion of the Chancellor. Knowledge in the scriptorium was never neutral. Edda smiled without warmth. "I know because I once put a foot where I should not. Because I was a novice who kept pages others wanted to destroy. Because the convent women are survivors like you and me. They remember what a page can do. And because I have friends who know how to shut a chest and cast a candle in a certain way." It irritated him that she spoke with such plainness, that she owed nothing to the theater of secrecy. If they will shelter it, will they read it? Will they understand what the ledger's implication is? Some will. Some will wrap it and bury it. Some will translate. If they read and understand, they will act with the kind of slow love that religious houses are good at. They will testify to one another and keep the tale alive. If they do not understand, the ledger will be as if wrapped in linen, present but mute. We need readers. She tapped his desk again, as if puncturing the air. We will need corroboration, and that means a hand that can read pale ink, and perhaps a witness who remembers the names. Matthias felt the old map of the city fold itself in his head. He thought of Sister Unwin. He had seen her once, years earlier, an unobtrusive figure at a memorial and later at market stalls where she bought cloth for the convent. She had always looked at books with a certain tenderness, the way one looks at a person recovering from fever. Could she be the hand Edda suggested? The idea arrived like a small winter sun, improbable but warm to imagine. "You say this solely as speculation," Matthias offered. "You do not promise me safety." "Do not ask me for promises, Matthias. Ask me for judgment. I will tell you what I think will carry weight, and I will tell you what will get us killed. If you want safety, there are measures you can take that do not involve exposing the ledger. I will lay them before you when the time comes. For now, know that every man in the Chancellor's office who can read a seal will be on the look for misfiles. They wash their hands of leaky truth in a way that will poison anyone who comes near it." His throat tightened. "Then why put yourself at risk?" Her jaw worked in a small motion, almost as if she tasted something bitter. "Because I have had convents burned and books scattered. I have stood in ruins and felt the weight of pages at my feet. There are things that I will not allow to be forgotten. Call it sentiment or call it disbelief in final forms of power. I suppose perhaps selfishly I keep lists so my own name will sound in some other person's memory when I am dead. But I also keep them because I want the world to be able to look back and see who it harmed. There is a justice owed to the dead that no ministry can buy." Her voice, though low, carried an edge of old grief. "And because, Matthias, I think you are not a man who can sleep if he leaves a ledger unspoken." He had not thought she would make him so visible, not in words, but in the suggestion that he might be incapable of peace. It was a small cruelty and a truth. He had not slept properly since opening the misfiled volume. Sometimes at night he lay awake and heard, faint as a bell, names being called out. He told himself the sound came from the ink drying, from the way the scriptorium's wood contracted and popped. It was a superstition, and yet it pressed at him like a bruise. Edda pushed a folio toward him. It was not the ledger, but a battered parish register stitched with twine. "If you insist upon this path," she said, "we will need proof. Not just names, but concordance." We will need an oath or a witness that ties a ledger to people who remember. I can show you where to look. There is a small Audust. Verns near the west gate.